First thing I'm talking about is the U.S. dropping more bombs on Afghanistan. This picked up pretty soon after the command for the war switched over from General Austin Scott Miller, who was at the Bagram Air Base when that closed. It switched over to CENTCOM, and that is General Kenneth McKenzie. And the U.S. again has picked up the number of airstrikes it is carrying out against the Taliban in support of the Afghan government. Now, the U.S. throughout this whole process has always maintained that it's going to have a over-the-horizon capability, is what they call it. But basically, it just means the ability to bomb or carry out raids in Afghanistan, and they're going to maintain this either from their bases in the Gulf. They're trying to get bases in Central Asia. I think they would like ideally the Pakistanis to let them have some kind of base, but Pakistan's already said no. So they're kind of in a bind on how they're carrying this out, but at least they're able to carry out airstrikes at this point with this over the horizon capability. And again, they've always talked about having this, although for the most part they've said it in relation to the war on terrorism, that we're not going to let Al-Qaeda rise in Afghanistan. If we find Al-Qaeda, rumors of Al-Qaeda, we're going to take them out. The jihadist types, the people who want to wage international terrorism against the United States. However, that isn't the Taliban, and so carrying out these airstrikes seems to already be a shift from the policy that Joe Biden laid out in his speech. Now, McKenzie made it clear that these strikes will not end, or he won't say if they will end, on August 31st, when Biden said the military mission in Afghanistan will end. Now, maybe he thinks this is like a tactical thing, and they're actually, there's a strict cutoff date for the Pentagon of the 31st to carry out strikes against the Taliban, the 31st of August, that is, and maybe they're rushing to carry them out now for that reason, seeing they only have a month to do this. But it is concerning that they're picking up the number of airstrikes, and he's unwilling to commit and tell the American people that, hey, the military mission ending on August 31st really does mean the mission against the Taliban, and that includes bombing them. As Biden, made the point he made in his speech, which I don't think is necessarily correct, that the U.S. has built the Afghans a military, but the point that he made was that it would be on the Afghan military at that point. Now, it may be incapable because the U.S. built them an incapable military and tried to force a government on the people of Afghanistan that wasn't going to work. But all that being said, that was, the position Biden made clear in his statement. And now it seems that McKenzie is at least second guessing that, if not outright saying that, we're going to blow past that deadline. Now, it has been as many as a dozen strikes, apparently. So this isn't insignificant. Maybe these are turning back offensive against district centers, which the U.S. government now admits that the Taliban control nearly half or more than half of in the country, and maybe trying to slow kind of the progress and the gains of the Taliban. One thing I want to talk about in the coverage of this is everybody, the mainstream media seems to like to make this point that the offensive in Afghanistan is increasing as the U.S. announced we were withdrawing. And this leaves out a lot of context to the situation. The offensive in Afghanistan by the Taliban was on pause really since I think halfway through 2019, but definitely starting in February 2020 when the Doha Accords were signed, what Trump called a peace agreement. It really wasn't, but an agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban where the U.S. would eventually leave Afghanistan. And I think the Taliban, weren't supposed to just go out and, slaughter the Afghan people. And during that time, and, since well over a year now, no American soldiers have died in Afghanistan. And so the Taliban offensive has been put on pause because the U.S. said that we would have our troops out of Afghanistan by May 1st. Now, you have another phenomenon in Afghanistan where the country essentially has a fighting season. People fight less during the winter months, then once it starts to warm up, it upticks. And so the announcement of the U.S. withdrawal coincided with that. And so with the fact that Biden had blown past Trump's deadline, and while the Taliban had said accepted that, Biden was extending the agreement. At the same time, the Taliban were like, it's now our fighting season, and so we're, going to war against the Afghan government as we had. And the Afghan government is at war against the Taliban, so is the United States. I mean, we're carrying out airstrikes against them. And so I think it's just misleading, and I want to point that out because I know this, I see it in so many of like the Reuters, the AP style articles I'm reading, where they're just kind of saying that, oh, the offensive is happening because the U.S. announced their withdrawal. Now, that may be in part why the Taliban is picking up so much ground, as I think the Afghan government is reassessing their strategy a little bit at this point, and they're defending less territory because, they have less support from the U.S. I mean, this is the world empire military machine, so you are going to have less of that support, then you could probably defend less than you would before. As I've always talked about with Afghanistan, once the U.S. leaves, there's going to be, it's very bloody, this analogy, but it is like a market style correction that's going to happen. There are people that are in power in certain places who would not be in power in that place if it wasn't for Americans occupying Afghanistan. So when the U.S. leaves, whenever that is, that's going to change. And so there is, I think, some of that going on, and that is accelerating because of the withdrawal. But they do leave out the whole context of Trump's deal, the slowdown in fighting over the past year, and the Afghan fighting season. A couple other interesting stories on Afghanistan. NATO affirms its support and continued funding for Afghan government, writes Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. He says the U.S. and NATO will give the Afghan government, or Afghan military, $4 billion each year, at least until 2024. Unknown after that. Now, when we say $4 billion from NATO and the U.S., there's really not a balance there or anything like that. The U.S. this year is going to give $3.3 billion, and so it almost waters down how much the U.S. ends up giving here when you say the U.S. and NATO, but $4 billion total is a ton of money. Now, while they're committing to doing this through 2024, who knows that the Afghan military is going to, control a substantial amount of Afghanistan for that long. And so I think it's very possible that this ends up changing, but that's what they're pledging at this point. It's an important sign to Americans that our government is going to continue to take billions of our tax dollars and give them to Afghanistan. And to the extent that there may be some cause, the U.S. has caused a ton of damage in that country. We've empowered warlords, poured weapons in, and given them to some of the worst people on the absolute planet, not just in Afghanistan, but just some of the most repulsive figures who have like the worst ideas and engage in ruthless and the sexual exploitation of young boys and stuff like that. The fact that we propped up all those people, maybe there is some humanitarian aid the U.S. could give Afghanistan, spending money on facilitating getting refugees out of the country, or putting them somewhere where they're going to be safe, but not to just dump the money into this military that is already hemorrhaging. We had an interesting statement from our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He said that Afghanistan would turn to a pariah state if the Taliban takes over the country by force. Now, I think there's some interesting parts about this statement that I want to break down. The first is that I don't know why he thinks this is the case. As I'm going to talk about in the coming stories here, China and Pakistan are both dealing with the Taliban, which are two of Afghanistan's most significant neighbors. And so that the idea that Afghanistan is going to become a pariah state, I don't know how much the Taliban are really going to care about UN recognition. I mean, it's going to be worse if the Taliban take over, because the U.S. is going to sanction the hell out of the country then. But at the same time, I don't think, the Taliban legitimacy or, becoming a pariah state can necessarily be determined just by the U.S. alone. And that I think there's plenty of states in the region that are going to work with the Taliban, whether they take over by force or not. Russia, Iran, China, Pakistan, with, probably the most significant of those countries being the Pakistan, a very strong U.S. ally. The other, I guess, issue I have here with Blinken's statement is he says there's only one path, and that's at the negotiating table to resolve the conflict peacefully. And the problem is that there's really not just one path for the Taliban. The Taliban have a lot of options at this point. And that's because the strong Pashtun, force in the country is the Taliban, and it looks like they have the military ability to take over that country, or at least significant portions of it. It seems like at this point, they're not taking some major cities just because they know they'll get bombed by the U.S., but if that threat ever leaves, they'll take over more. And so I don't think the Taliban are just limited to that one path forward, and Blinken is just saying it because he wants to create this narrative that if the Taliban won't pursue this one path, then the U.S. has to bomb them. Talking about the Taliban associating with neighboring states, China received a Taliban designation and said the Taliban will play an important role in the future of Afghan reconstruction. I'm sure for people who are going to, countries that are going to invest money in building infrastructure in Afghanistan, while, maybe not a massive border for people who are watching the show here, could see that this little stretch of land from Afghanistan that cuts between Turkmenistan and Pakistan actually does share a border with China, and that is the Uyghur area of China, the Xinjiang province that the U.S. criticizes China for human rights violations there, right? And so, with that, and China, having this massive Belt and Road initiative, this probably signals to me that China is saying that, hey, we're willing to invest in Afghanistan, even if the Taliban continue to rise to power. Now, the Chinese said that, and they also made a request from the Taliban, and that was for the Taliban to sever ties with the East Turkmenistan Islamic movement, and this is the Uyghur Muslim group that Beijing accuses of being behind terrorist attacks in the Xinjiang province. Previously, the U.S. had labeled this group as a terrorist organization. In fact, in 2018, the U.S. bombed, this is under Trump, bombed this group in Afghanistan, although this group was taken off the terrorist list by the Trump administration eventually. Something that I've talked about in the past on the show too is we know there's a large number, thousands of Uyghur fighters who did travel to Syria to fight on the side of the jihadists, whether that be the Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, HTS types, or the Islamic State fighters in that country. Pakistan is shown willingness to talk with the Taliban. Obviously, there's some long-standing ties there, but after Afghan soldiers fled over the border into Pakistan, and the Taliban took another border crossing, this time with Pakistan. That border crossing was reopened. And so these border crossings reopening suggests to me that to some extent Pakistan, going to recognize the Taliban, and is going to allow commerce to cross over that border. I think after it was taken, like 100 trucks crossed over that the next day. These are the kind of things that is going to allow the Taliban to get even probably more tariffs and tats and stuff like that, and even more legitimately be the governing force of Afghanistan. And so no matter what Blinken says, trying to call and label Afghanistan a pariah state, it is, I think, that the Taliban would be a state that would be accepted by most of its neighbors, and that's something the U.S., I guess, will have to reckon with when we talk about our foreign policy for Afghanistan moving forward. The U.S. says it's deeply troubled by Taliban attacks on civilians, and this seems to me to be the, kind of war state actors in the Biden administration doing everything they can to try to drum up cause and demands for the U.S. not to leave that country. Again, this with the current bombing campaign going on and this increased rhetoric, while the U.S. is down to apparently 600 something troops there at the embassy, and this is a significant drawdown. We gave up the Bagram Air Base, at least at this point. The idea that the U.S. has completely ended this war and it's a foregone conclusion that this war is over is not yet there. And maybe this is the last gaps of the war state trying to save this war. At the same time, it may be what the war state actually needs to keep a more significant U.S. presence in that country. I don't think the track is set for the path the Biden administration is on, and that they're going to continue to try to increase the amount of intervention we have in Afghanistan going forward. Now, it's interesting, the U.S. is constantly condemning the Taliban for human rights abuses, which they commit plenty of. No, not contesting that. The Taliban are not, some heroic, fighting force. They're not exactly the, maybe the founding fathers had some more dark aspects of them than are portrayed in public schools, but we have a certain glorified image of the founding fathers. The Taliban are definitely not them. At the same time, the Afghan government is certainly committing their fair share of human rights abuses, recently arresting 4 journalists and charging them on propaganda charges for trying to get into an area that there was a contest in between the Afghan government and the Taliban. This is a clear human rights violation. It's something you shouldn't be doing to journalists, and yet the Afghan government is carrying that out. All right, now let's